There's no question that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is an absolutely humongous game, but within this game lies a few references to other Final Fantasy games, and I'm not just talking about Final Fantasy VII compilation games, I'm talking about games outside of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. You should be warned that there are spoilers regarding Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and possibly some other Final Fantasy games, so this is your last warning. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth truly is a love letter to the Final Fantasy franchise. So without further ado, I'm Joshua Thomas, you're watching the FailroadExpress, and we're here to talk about some references in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth about other Final Fantasy games. And where better to start than with our first reference, which is one of our most obvious, the eccentric swordsman, who turns out to be none other than Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh made his first appearance in Final Fantasy V and has been in multiple other Final Fantasies including 6, 8, 9, 12, 14, 15, and more. In most of these games, Gilgamesh is this interdimensional traveling swordsman who is on a mission to, well, collect as many weapons as he can. And in some cases, he also may mention something about the Genji armor, which is another reference to Final Fantasy, in that the Genji armor is usually a late-game armor set in which the player can obtain and is usually very powerful. But back to Gilgamesh, in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, he is the very same character as he is in Final Fantasy V and many of the other Final Fantasy games. Unlike other reoccurring characters such as Cid or Moogles or Chocobos, Gilgamesh is actually the same character from most of these different Final Fantasy games. Because he is an interdimensional traveler, all of these different Final Fantasies that he appears in, he is traveling to them from another dimension in search of greatness and weapons. You usually encounter him either as a summonable character or usually as a rival, sometimes an ally, and sometimes as, well, all of the above. Gilgamesh is oftentimes a very quirky character and used as comedic relief, or just simply has some very funny attributes to him. And he is no different in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as he is definitely a fumbling buffoon in many of his scenes.
So it comes to this!
Now we're going to skip all the way to the very end of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, in which Cid hums the theme to Final Fantasy. But it doesn't just end there. If we look at the original Final Fantasy from 1987, the opening in which we hear this theme song is very reminiscent of, well, the scene that we see at the end of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We see here that we have our heroes on the edge of a hillside with a body of water, a landmass on the other side of the water, and in the original Final Fantasy there is a castle in the far distance. But look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and we see that we have Cloud, our hero, sitting on a hilltop with a body of water separating land, and on the other side we have what appear to be ruins of some ancient civilization. The resemblance here is remarkable, and I love this attention to detail that the devs have given us here. Now we're moving on to Loveless, in which we have several references. Loveless is of course the famous play that exists within the Final Fantasy VII universe, and has been mentioned in multiple games, and in 7 Rebirth we actually get to play as the characters in Loveless. During the final fight with the Dragon King Varvados, we actually see Cloud do what appears to be a warp strike, which is very reminiscent of Noctis from Final Fantasy XV, whose Warp Strike is like his signature move. Now, if we look at the Warp Strike that Cloud does in Loveless, we can tell that there are some differences, but let's be honest, this is just a cool reference, and it could be a situation in which the devs said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Cloud did this move where he throws the sword and then warps over to the sword? Whether it was a direct reference to Final Fantasy XV, I don't know, but let's be honest, we can make the connection there. The next reference that we have in Loveless is actually the setting of the play itself. In Loveless in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the setting is the city of Guardia. Does that sound familiar? Well, you might be surprised, but it's actually not a reference to a Final Fantasy game, but another game that is extremely important to the Final Fantasy VII franchise. That is Chrono Trigger. In Chrono Trigger, there is a kingdom of Guardia, which is known as the Kingdom of Humans. And while this is a kingdom and not a city, the fact that both of them are named Guardia can't be missed. Chrono Trigger plays an extremely important part in the development of Final Fantasy VII, as the team that was working on Final Fantasy VII actually got pulled to help out with the development of Chrono Trigger, as Chrono Trigger was falling way behind in its development, which also caused Final Fantasy VII to be delayed. In fact, if it wasn't for this delay, there's no telling how Final Fantasy VII may have differed. It may have even ended up on the Nintendo 64 instead of the PlayStation. But it's thanks to the delay in the production of Final Fantasy VII that we have the game that we know and love today. And the final Loveless reference that I noticed is Cloud's final words at the end of the play. Listen to this.
You needn't promise that you'll wait, for I know that I will find you here.
His words are remarkably similar to the opening to Final Fantasy VIII, in which we see the on-screen text that reads, "I'll be waiting for you, so if you come here, you'll find me. I promise." Now, when you listen to that, there are definitely similarities, but listen to them one after the other. It almost sounds like the words that Cloud says in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth are almost a reaction to the words in Final Fantasy VIII. Here we go again. "I'll be waiting for you, so if you come here, you'll find me. I promise."
You needn't promise that you'll wait, for I know that I will find you here.
After hearing it like that, it's almost impossible not to think that the devs intentionally worded this so that it would have a connection to Final Fantasy VIII. But once again, this could be just one of those situations where the fans noticed a similarity in these two different dialogues, and that the devs didn't intentionally connect Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy VIII. Moving on from Loveless, we have a mini-game that references Final Fantasy XII, and that is Gears and Gambits. In Gears and Gambits, you have a system in which you have to program these little robots in order to fight for you, and depending on how you program them is going to determine what kind of moves they use and under what situations they use these moves. It is actually almost identical to the Gambit system in Final Fantasy XII. In fact, looking at these side by side, they are almost identical, and then if you look at the combat systems for both, it's hard to deny that the Gears and Gambits in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is absolutely a throwback to Final Fantasy XII. So if you didn't like Gears and Gambits, well, you might not like Final Fantasy XII's combat system, though I will say that Final Fantasy XII does a better job of slowly introducing you to the combat system than Gears and Gambits did. There have long been theories that Final Fantasy VII's world and Final Fantasy X's world are connected. This started off as a fan theory, and in Final Fantasy VII Remake was almost guaranteed with a single photograph in the Shinra HQ building, and now we have another reference with Aerith's dance that she performs while attempting to utilize the powers of her Cetra heritage. This dance is absolutely reminiscent of the sending that Yuna performs in Final Fantasy X. I mean, it's hard not to make a connection when you have a lead female wearing a dress who is a magic user and a staff wielder performing a dance. It's also coincidental that both of these characters sing in their games. Well, Yuna in Final Fantasy X too. Nevertheless, it's still a connection. I've placed these two dances side by side so that you can see them in comparison. We'll note that Yuna's dance has been edited out of order so that I can pair them with shots that look similar in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's also important to note that while Yuna is performing a sending, which sends the souls of the dead to the far plane or the afterlife, Aerith is attempting to summon the powers of the life stream, which is made up of the memories of the dead. So these are two different things, and it's also important to note that Yuna's dance appears to be much more learned and methodical, whereas Aerith's dance appears to be much more improvised. Nevertheless, the connection is absolutely there. And finally, this is more of a broad reference of Final Fantasies 1 through 10, but in Nibelheim in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you can see some kids playing what appears to be a turn-based game. A turn-based combat system that is very similar to, once again, combat systems that were utilized in Final Fantasies 1 through 10, but especially in the 3D ones where you had 3 characters on one side and an enemy on the other, or multiple enemies on the other side. And this definitely is a reference most likely back to the original Final Fantasy VII, but we can't help but notice the references to other Final Fantasies as well. Those are all of the references to other Final Fantasy games that I noticed in Final Fantasy VII Remake. I would love to hear what references you saw in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth of other Final Fantasy games. Thank you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you will like and subscribe and check out more Final Fantasy content and other video game content on the FailroadExpress. Check you guys next time.
Don't need to beg, just call up back at Bag's Business or something.